evening, everybody. Your Excellencies, Presidents, Prime Minister, and Ministers, dear colleagues, guests, welcome to our institute, l'Institut d'Egypte. This evening, we have a very important event to discuss the future of Europe. We are more than happy and proud to host this event here in the institution with the presence of such VVIP attendants from abroad and from Egypt. I hope this evening to have a very successful and fruitful discussion. By the way, let me take this chance to congratulate my colleague, Dr. Mustafa Al-Fiqi, for his new post as the Managing Director of the Library of Alexandria, Biblioteca Alexandria. We hope all the success in his efforts to make the library more and more dynamic locally and internationally. At this, I will leave the floor to Dr. Ismail Sirajuddin. He is a member of this institute, and most of you know that he was the managing director of Alexandria Biblioteca, and he did a very good effort during the past 15 years. The floor is for you, Dr. Ismail, please.
Thank you very much, dear President Farouk Ismail. It's a great privilege for me on behalf of all the members of the Academy and of the Managing Board of the Academy to welcome 4 very distinguished guests. We have Her Excellency Vaira Viki Freiberga, who is the former President of Latvia. We have His Excellency Boris Tadic, former President of Serbia. We have His Excellency Recep Mejdani, former President of Albania. And we have His Excellency Zlatko Lagumdzija, former Prime Minister of Bosnia. I will now be making a special presentation about the challenges before Europe. And as our President has said, the theme of the discussion will be the future of Europe. And then I will invite our 4 guests to join us here. They will have a chance to present their views on this very important topic as 4 leaders of Europe. And I am then hoping after the panel discussion that we will have here, I will call on 2 of our very distinguished members of the Academy, His Excellency Amr Musa and His Excellency Dr. Mustafa Al-Fiqi, to each to be a designated discussant. So, ta'qib from Dr. Amr Musa, ta'qib from Dr. Mustafa Al-Fiqi, after which, if we still have time, we will be opening the floor for some comments, questions from the floor. We hope to complete this event by 8 o'clock this evening. Now, because I will use slides, everybody should be sitting there. And I suggest that His Excellency, our President, would prefer to look at the slides rather than try to turn around. Okay, I'm hoping that everybody can see quite well. And let me run through on these reflections on the future of Europe. Well, first of all, we all know that the fear that people have been reflecting on is about the rise of populism. And we have seen a strong rejection of globalization and trade, which many people feel has responsible for the inequalities and the loss of jobs. There has been a rejection of multiculturalism and immigration. There has been a fear of terror, especially seen as jihadist terrorism perpetrated by Muslim radicals, and that feeds into xenophobia and racism in society. And finally, there has been a rejection of the elite that governs both America and Europe. In the case of America, it is the fabled 1% of Wall Street fame, because if you recall, a few years ago, we had these first Liberate Wall Street demonstrations some time ago, and then the arguments about the 1% found their way from America to Europe as well. And that is coupled with a profound distrust and disgust at the political establishment represented, that governs America, but also that represented by the established political parties. So these were four manifestations of that. And if we look at the first one, well, globalization has had a major impact, it is true, but it has also lifted some countries like China. But fundamentally, it has come across, sweeping across all nations. There's hardly any nation that can keep separated from it, maybe possible exception being something like North Korea, because the technological transformation has bound us together specifically by the internet. We communicate at the speed of light. We, in fact, can transfer funds around the planet. Markets have become much bigger. $1 trillion is not a big thing now for global markets. And society has been moving ever faster. It created a financial system that was out of control, and in 2008, we saw the collapse of that. But more importantly, it created enormous differences in wealth. So yes, there are very powerful, wealthy people, but there were also an urban underclass that emerged in the West. So the rich West, not everybody was rich in the West. And there's a general feeling that the very rich and powerful basically are stepping all over everybody. And guess what? It turns out that the statistics say this feeling is true. They are, and I will show that in a moment. But more serious, especially in Europe, has been unemployment and youth unemployment. Unemployment has been stubborn in Europe, and you can look at youth unemployment reaching over 50% at some points in Spain and Greece. But by and large, we have had very high unemployment levels. And it is not the result of just the result of the euro, but this is the trends in youth unemployment. As you saw, it reached very high in the 90s, then went up again later on. This is, the euro was introduced, and this is the Lehman collapse, which marks the 2008 major depression. So what do we talk about when I say youth unemployment? In general, in June 2016, the unemployment rate was 18.5% in the 28 countries of the EU and in the euro area, compared to 20 and 22 in June 2015, so slightly improving. But while the lowest observed were in Germany and Malta, the highest in Greece, 47.5%, Spain, 45.8%. These are the European statistics for 2016. So this is like 50% of young people are unemployed and have no stake in the societies that they're facing. In America, unemployment reached 10%, and this was during the big collapse. And then in the Obama years, it was brought down very significantly. And as you know, it's now under 4% globally in the United States. For youth, it's about just under 10%. Unemployment rates for youth 16 to 24 are double the national average in the US, in Spain, everywhere. So if the original unemployment level is high, the youth unemployment level tends to be twice as high everywhere. So let's move on the rejection of multiculturalism and immigration. We know the story of immigration and the barriers that were set up and the difficulties that they're being confronted. And the fear of immigration has changed a perception that people used to have about strength in diversity to a fear for national identity. So what was welcoming diversity has now become a fear for national identity. But there's also fear of terror. So there has been terrorist attacks, they continue to exist, and they are closely identified in the minds of the European public with radical Islam. And there has been a profound rejection of the elite both in America and in Europe. And that resentment is really because of rising inequality in a large part. In fact, in every country of the world, in the last 30 years or so, inequality has increased. From Sweden to Somalia, in practically every, even China, the inequality has increased. These are Gini coefficients. Going on this side is perfect equality. Going on that side is perfect inequality, from 0 to 1. So this is where it used to be in 1985 and where it is now in 2013. In every case, there has been a movement to the right. Every single society, inequality has increased. And inequality has been very devastating. In this case, this is the United States, and it's a reflection of the so-called Reagan-Thatcher program. This is, the yellow is the bottom 50% of society, and the red is the top 1% of society. Now, in 1980, when Reagan and Thatcher came in, the bottom 50 had twice as much as the top 1%. Then, as you can see, this was the time when we were told, governs best that governs least, give the private sector possibility, the private sector will do everything, even public goods, et cetera, and before we knew it, in fact, the bottom 50 lost more and more and more share of income. The bottom 1% had more and more and more of the income, until the bottom 1% have 20% of the total income, bottom 1%, and the bottom 50% of the population have now barely over 12%, or almost 10%. So it was reversed. The position was reversed. But, and this explains what happened in the United States, it doesn't make any difference whether they're Democrats or Republicans. The line you see before you is not affected by who's in control. These are forces that have been put into society and they're working, and thus the general alienation of the public is there as well. Plus, there are problems in the emerging world order. We know that China and Russia, as well as India and the rest, are vying for their positions in a revised world order. So Europe finds itself with the United States, China and Russia, vying for a position in this new world order, a world order where standing in the wings is India, Brazil, and other countries as well. But fundamentally, these are the big four, so to speak. And Europe is still a superpower. And there is a beautiful essay by Andrew Moravec, who basically said Europe is still a superpower, and he shows the following observations. He was talking initially about the relationship with Russia, and he says, in the end, 50% of Russia's trade is with Europe, but for Europe, Russia is a much smaller percentage of that. And as to military strength, well, if you count individual countries as individual countries, yes, they do not appear as very powerful. But if you count Europe as Europe, the Europe of the 28, or now the 27 after Brexit, then we will notice that it is powerful. Now, this is in aggregate military spending, but Europe is not standing alone. It is part of NATO. And NATO alone is more than 57% of the planet. And if you count Japan and Korea along with NATO, which are very, very strong allies of the United States and NATO, then we're talking about 63% of world military spending, almost 2/3 of world military spending, of which Europe is an integral part. As to the economy, well, the European bloc is as large as the United States and much larger than China. $17 trillion, this was 2016 statistics, versus $18 trillion for the United States, almost equal in every respect. Merchandise and service imports and exports by country, the EU is by far both the biggest exporter and the biggest importer in anything and everything that you can think of in economics. Trade dependence, which means basically how dependent a country is on trade, and therefore how likely they are to be affected by, say, for example, sanctions or anything like that. In fact, the US and the EU are far less dependent than China. And foreign direct investment stocks, Europe is by far the greatest investor elsewhere and the recipient of investment into Europe from anywhere else. And by a large margin, it's better than the US and far greater than China, despite what we hear today in terms of what China is now doing today. And I think this is compelling information. And for tax revenues, how much resources the governments of Europe have? They have far more than the US government and China. And official financing to help other countries, they are far greater than Europe and US and China. And their contributions to the UN are also greater. And if you think of their impact, cultural impact, the percent of international students, there's non-EU students. We're not comparing now the programs where German and French and Latvian and Dutch students are going to European universities. We're saying non-EU students at EU universities, 40%, far more, twice as much as the United States, which has a very powerful higher education. And this, of course, in terms of languages, English is by far the dominant international language. But what are the other ones? French, Arabic, Spanish, Mandarin, and Russian coming very late. So English, French, and Spanish, being, of course, European languages, show an enormous soft power. And this is in Olympic medals, another form of soft power. Well, if you count the EU as a whole, then they have by far 3 times as many medals as the US, almost 4 times as much as China and Russia. So in this view, if Europe integrates even more, it will remain a global superpower. And there are many who still cherish their participation in the EU. But we have recent political manifestations. The vote for Brexit, which shook everybody last year. The success of Mr. Trump, who threatened to withdraw from NATO or do all sorts of things and so on. And we've had 3 major tests in Europe. There was the Austrian presidential campaign, which resulted in the defeat of Norbert Hofer, who was considered an extreme right-wing populist. But point out that the victory was 54% of the vote. I mean, that still means that 46% of the people voted for Mr. Hofer. And Geert Wilders was stopped in the Netherlands in March of this year, but his Freedom Party still got 20% of the seat. And we just had Macron defeating Marine Le Pen in France, and Macron was defending that France should remain in the Euro and in the EU. Marine Le Pen was arguing to remove France from that. So 66% to 34%, but with massive non-participation and blank votes. 25% of the public did not participate, 8% of the votes were cast blank. And Marine Le Pen still got over 1/3 of the public. So while a lot of the votes for Macron were opposed to Marine Le Pen, they were not necessarily supporting the EU. Mr. Mélenchon of the extreme left, for example, had almost 19.6% of the vote in the first round. He supported, and his supporters supported Mr. Macron, but they do not believe in the idea of staying in the Euro and the EU. So there's behind these 3 victories, there are some questions to be asked. And so, having said that, I would like now to pose these questions. So what do all these statistics, where are we going? Will Europe splinter like the people who supported the Brexit were predicting? What is the future of Europe? And what will Europe's role be in the world? Now, these 4 questions, I would like to turn to our panel and invite our very, very distinguished panel to come and join me up here and to share their views about the future of Europe. So may I ask, first and foremost, President Vaira Vike-Freiberga to come and join me, former President of Latvia. I would now like to ask President Boris Tadic, former President of Serbia, to please join us here at the podium. President Rajab Maidani, President of Albania. And Prime Minister Zlatko Lagumdziza, Prime Minister of Bosnia. Okay, then we'll start with Her Excellency Vaira Vike-Freiberga, former President of Latvia. Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, may I express my emotion at being here at the Institut d'Egypte, which to me was a fabulous place when I was a schoolgirl in Casablanca. And generally, sort of one of the iconic places where past heritage is investigated, preserved for posterity with sketches and whatever technical instruments one has at the time. And this is why it's been such a pleasure working for the past 6 years on the trust fund, for the Board of Trustees of the Biblioteca Alexandrina, because it has taken also part in this very important task of preserving the past so that we can have a better basis for moving into the future. We do not always learn from history much as we don't learn from the mistakes of others, and sadly not even from our own very often. But nonetheless, it remains an extremely important aspect. And I must say that I'm sure not just all of Europe, but the world was saddened to hear that after the wonderful emotions that the Arab Spring elicited as something like the French Revolution with ideas of liberty, equality, and freedom, this venerable institution was set afire and lost irreplaceable documents. I understand that, we see that it has been restored, and I understand that efforts are being made to replace the documents. But this remains a grave loss, and let us hope that the destruction of treasures from history does not continue in a way we see it on our daily news happening here or there in the world, and it is a very sad thing indeed. About Europe, well, I must say that as I say, I was a schoolgirl in Casablanca, and then when the Europeans left en masse Morocco, the French returning to France, but others, refugees of the Second World War, like my parents, looked to the New World and settled in Canada. So that I've been shaped by 3 continents. Born in Europe, then spending my formative years in North Africa, and then my productive adult life in North America. And then after taking early retirement, 8 months later being elected president of my native country, a somewhat circuitous route to get to be the president of one's country. I would like to look at Europe from this perspective of somebody who was away from it from the greater part of my life, but came back in it extremely engaged and extremely active by force of necessity, of course, simply as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the three Baltic countries which had been occupied and annexed militarily, and the satellite countries were freed of the yoke of the directives from Moscow and as well as the communist doctrine. And they, with great joy, embraced, of course, the Western values, the Western way of life, with a full conviction that very quickly they would reach the same level as those countries that had been developing under democracy and under free markets, and increasingly common markets, ever since the Schuman-Monet Declaration 60 years ago. I'd like to mention a few words about an exercise that was undertaken in Europe something like 10 years ago, where 12 persons, independent personalities, were selected by the leaders of Europe to come together as a neutral group, not representing each one of the members of the European Union, but just simply 12 persons like the 12 apostles, and to sit down and reflect on the future of Europe and make recommendations. And this group was chaired by Felipe González, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Spain after the fall of Franco, the death of Franco, and vice chairs were myself from Latvia and Jorma Ollila, who at the time was the president of Nokia from Finland. We had people like Rem Koolhaas, the world-famous architect on this group, Mario Monti, who later became Prime Minister of Italy and so forth. It was a very interesting, Lech Walesa from Poland. So we had a very broad variety of thoughts represented, and it took us 2 years of steady meetings. And when the Lisbon Treaty came into effect, and Europe for the first time elected a common representative in the person of Mr. Van Rompuy, we were able in December 2009 to hand over to Mr. Van Rompuy the recommendations of the group about the future of Europe. As all of you who have participated in writing reports will know, a lot of effort goes into making recommendations, analysis, and so on. And then the question is, does the report gather dust on a shelf, or do some of the thoughts survive the actual setting the ideas down? And I would say that several of them have. The document, by the way, is available on the internet. It's still there. And one of the things that we first noted about Europe is that it truly, back in 2007, when we started, it was an economic giant on the world scale, but politically it was a dwarf. It didn't carry the weight in international affairs that this tremendous economic force, the joint force of the European countries, could carry with it. It was not by far as influential as, for instance, the United States in influencing world affairs. Absolutely clear in that regard. The other thing we noted is that Europe had an enormous number of persons, and I say persons because they're both men and women, in uniform. But in terms of its defensive power and its ability to actually intervene, it was not getting enough bang for its euro. A lot of money was spent, but there was a lack of compatibility between the expenditures and the investments made by each country, in spite of the fact that so many European countries are members of NATO. And NATO has been working for decades on the interoperability of defense forces between the member nations. And I remember in a previous incarnation, I was representing Canada at a scientific committee in Brussels, in NATO, and one of the tasks it had was again to look for a recommendation as to how this coordination could be done better. And since then, there have been a number of groups, again, meeting, of which I have been a part, notably one chaired by Javier Solana, a former president of the Commission, of the European Commission, of NATO, and with a number of generals sitting on it. The conclusion was exactly the same as in the report we made in 2009. Europe still spends collectively a great deal of money on defense, but the effectiveness of this investment is not nearly as great as it should be, because if you have 16 different types of tanks manufactured in different countries, each country supporting its own champions for producing both military ordnance or equipment, interestingly enough, Europe is a very large exporter of arms, and that is somehow not necessarily part of the image that it likes to project of itself as a sort of peacemaker, and a continent, after all, that has had, I suppose, for I don't know if it's the first time in history, but certainly for a very long time, has had since 1945. It had a great long period of peace until the Balkans erupted and blood was shed again. And of course now we have the situation in Ukraine. The capability of Europe to carry the weight that its numbers and that its economy actually merit really does depend on its ability to coordinate at a supranational level its efforts without erasing the authority, the sovereignty, and the legitimacy of the nation state. And in that sense, the European Union is a unique construction. There has never been a beast of that nature. We have federations like Canada and the United States and others. Germany is a federation of Länder. We have countries with states where a great deal, Canada has provinces. You have a great deal of authority that is delegated to the subsidiary bodies. But even though subsidiarity is one of the major principles of the European Union, it is a subsidiarity that operates through the integrity and the identity of the nation state. And I think Europeans, because of their long history, are attached to their national identity. They are attached to the idea of a territorial integrity. They are attached to the fact of a certain national identity. Now, I'll grant you that the stereotypes that countries carry in the eyes of others obviously are superficial and do not reflect the real state of affairs, and certainly not the changing world that we're experiencing and the globalization that we're experiencing today. Holland or the Netherlands is not windmills. I think there's 7 windmills left that are still functioning, and it's not wooden clogs and tulips, although they are the biggest exporters of tulips in the world, I'll grant you. So that the stereotypes are not the only thing that identify Europe, but there is an attachment to each language. And there are 24 official languages in the European Europe. And people do not wish to lose that. And I think this is one of the things when we talk about xenophobia or when we talk about reticence towards mass immigration. One has to respect the basic sense and the sentiment of people in a country that their identity is linked to their common sense of belonging to a nation that has a past, a common history, checkered as that history may be, but their history. And language, well, one language, two languages, three, four languages, that varies from country to country, but they do have this. In Switzerland, which is not a member of the European Union, in Switzerland you definitely have an identity with your canton and with your language and so on. This is something that the globalized world in many ways is threatening. Now, in more homogeneous places of the world, it's perceived less as a danger. But I think what is happening, for instance, in Indonesia these days, with Muslim fundamentalism becoming increasingly aggressive and intolerant towards any other religions. I think that this is something that the whole world is facing. It is not a uniquely European phenomenon. The Chinese are very attached to their sense of being Chinese, of having a civilization, as they say, 5,000 years old. They will claim that it is the oldest in the world. They can dispute with the Egyptians whether that is the case or not. Interesting topic for debate. But the xenophobia, we must realize that xenophobia is a pathological state, whereas patriotism and attachment to one's identity is something entirely different. And I think we have to, when we have debates about this question, we mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We must realize that there's a positive side, and people feel rootless. What Emil Durkheim, the father of sociology, called anomie, a sense of not having a name, of not having an identity, of not having roots, of not belonging anywhere. This creates a population that is very unhappy and in fact, very open then to various populist promises and events. The events since 2008, I think, have shown not just a European problem, but a worldwide problem. And I think Dr. Ismail, with his experience with the World Bank, I don't know if he'll agree with me when I say that I think there's a crisis of capitalism. Is that the capital as such, first of all, has become, as he has shown quite clearly on his slides, has been concentrating in a too narrow a portion of general population worldwide, and that is not healthy. But secondly, the guardians of capital, which have been the banks, and which had always been a symbol. I worked as a teenager when I arrived in Canada. I had to work as a bank, quit school and worked in the bank. I had a brass cage around me, you see, a teller's cage, and there was a wicket where customers could come to deposit or withdraw their money. And the bank was, and this brass cage and the safes of a bank were symbols of security. You saved, you worked, and you, if you had anything left over, you would deposit it in the bank and count on it to receive it even with interest. And when Lehman Brothers went down, and Fannie Mae and everything else, we discovered their shenanigans and the impact it was having on the population. I think that people's faith in capitalism was seriously damaged. And this, in fact, spread, of course, to Europe and all the countries that were touched by it, by the crisis. And there was a contagion from financial insecurity to resentment to the political elite for not having protected the population. So that the resentment that was felt against bankers, for sure, and I apologize to any bankers here present, some of my best friends are bankers or ex-bankers, and you know, I love them dearly as individuals, but bankers as a profession, I think, have a lot to answer for. And the crisis of 2008 and the effects it had in terms of unemployment, of loss of jobs, of lowering of purchasing power in so many countries in the world, youth unemployment that Ismail showed so clearly. And in fact, the figures were worse. in a few years ago, in the youth unemployment was 60% in Greece and 50% in Spain. It has been improving since then. Now, why we have youth employment, that is linked also to the structures. The Europe that we reported on in 2009 was one that was supposed to be, if you like, capitalism with a human face. Democracies where you would have free markets, you would have open markets, you open up the borders, this would improve trade, this would improve welfare, but there would be a social security blanket, and people would be protected. I think since the big crisis of 2009, the faith of people, both in the systems of governance of their countries, certainly the banks, and as I say, by contagion with the politicians, has been damaged. And we have reached the situation, the crisis that we saw earlier described by my colleague, Dr. Ismail. With this, I will remain open to, address various other aspects of the European story if we have time for questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, President Vaira, and duly noted. I think there used to be an expression called, it's like money in the bank. But I don't think people say that anymore. After 2008, it's no longer safe money in the bank. The discussion we've had has covered a wide range, and let me turn now to my colleague Zlatko Ragomzija, Prime Minister of Bosnia. You've had a very different experience in getting into Europe, and perhaps you would share with us your perspective on the challenges that we've identified for Europe, and perhaps tell us where you think it's going.
Well, thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ismail, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues. First, I want, before passing 3 questions for thoughts, I'll just say something about the title of our lecture, which is questionable itself. The title is The Future of Europe. But actually what we are talking about was European Union. So that's the fact, and it was normal that when we speak about the future of Europe, we speak about the future of European Union, which is, by the way, not normal. But that's the way it is. Why European Union is so important? Because Europe as a whole is very important. And because we are living in a world in which Ismail gave us very good example and pointed out to the really extraordinary article about the superpowerness of the European Union. Having said so, I want to, without going into more precise, detailed data, I will refer to, and what I have in front of me, I have very often, is first question that I'm pointing out to myself is why the European Union is so important for the rest of Europe and for the future of Europe as a whole. First reason why is actually lays in success or successes of European Union as a project. First success is the fact that there are 500 million people are living in freedom, in stability, and they are free to live according to their beliefs, being united in diversities, because they are free to study where they want, among 500 million of them, and they're free actually to work where they want, to live, to study, and to work. So 500 people with all those differences, united in diversities. That is the reason why Europe is so important, because of that fact. The second fact is the fact that this is biggest single free market. And it begs the example of that big market is maybe something which is called KAP, or Common Agriculture Policy, which actually enabled the countries of the European Union to produce enormous amount of food, as someone would say, trillions of kilos of mountains of butter and lakes of the wine and milk, which was not happening before. If that would be stopped, then not only Europe, but the people who, to a certain extent, also depend on that fact, would have a problem. So that's second why the European Union is, for me, so important, because I like sometimes European wine and milk and cheese. So, third reason why is because the biggest success of the European Union is the fact that this is the biggest peace project in the history of the mankind. As never before in history, people in that part of the world, or such a big part of the world in recorded history, lived without any wars. So that's the reason why we have to, let's say, care so much about it. As I said yesterday when we were in a meeting with His Excellency Mr. President, that Europe is so important, or too important, to be left only to Europeans, or that European Union is even more important to be left only to European unions. Politicians, thinkers, citizens, citoyens, or whoever. Second question, where the Europe is today, not in the sense of the data that are marvelous data, that made me think even more. I'll show with you the three, let's say, charts that I was using for my own thoughts recently. One chart that is giving, and I think when we were Roshan in Concordia meeting with Nizami in New York, I think that was the time when we had a similar panel, some of us, when it was given a chart to us, research of the optimism and pessimism of the people in different parts of the world. Europe, USA, Latin America, Asia, Middle East, and so on. That chart is it was, for me, very, let's say, warning chart. And it made me actually realize where are we in Europe. It says that, asked on a question, do you think that your kids will have better future than you have today? The most pessimistic people in the world are European Union citizens. So the ratio of pessimists over optimists is 2-to-1 in Europe. When you look at South Latin America or Asia, it's different, completely flipped. In the Middle East, it's, let's say, more optimists, believe it or not, than pessimists. But not as much as people in Asia or Latin America are optimistic about the future. Of course, Europe has always someone who we are looking at, like, who is encouragement for us or discouragement for us, which is the United States. Their people are as pessimist as Europeans. So that's the first fact that I want to share with you. Where are we? Now, the second fact, second chart, which I'm using for thoughts, is a chart that is talking about European opinion about different countries. And I don't want to go in details, but it's very, very illustrative. Details are very illustrative. When people were asked in different countries, what is correlation in between how much they're afraid of terrorism, how much they're afraid of refugees, and how much they're afraid of living in more diverse society. On a medium European level, it differs from country to country. But on a medium level, you can see that people are as threatened with ISIL as much as refugees. And the number of people who are scared of living in diversities is growing. From the countries like Greece and Poland, who simply don't accept diversities no more, according to their statistics, to the, let's say, Spain, Sweden, who are accepting diversities. So it's not North and South division. You have, let's say, scared with diversity, Poland and Greece, and not so scared with diversity, Sweden and Spain. So it's not North and South division. Having in mind that today's Europe is divided on North and South in competitiveness sense. Because when you take a look at the World Economic Reform Competitiveness Report, you can see that top 10 European countries Now I say European, I mean from Atlantic to Caucasus, to Ural and down there. When you take those as Martians would see Europe, because they have no way, they don't see the borders, so they see Europe as a geographic entity. So from Atlantic to that Caucasus, you see that out of the top 10 the most competitive countries in that part of the world, all of them are from northwestern part of Europe. All of them. 8 from EU, and 2 of them are not from EU, which is Norway and Switzerland. So that division exists. And the third very interesting data is the one that says that survey made in the European Union among member states, citizens, how much you are getting from EU. And it is self-evident that in the last few years there was some kind of uphill peak, that people were more believing in the European Union, that the European Union is giving something to them. In 2014, 2015, and then it went down. Now, having said so, I'm asking myself as well, and probably all of us are asking ourselves, is what should be done? And I won't say too much, I'll say just 3 little things. First one is, I think that we need a vision of Europe that is actually for real. That the vision is something which people are serious about. The vision of Europe of values, unity and diversity, that this is something for real. That this is not just nice small talk or double talk. That this is something which is for real. In that context, I think that instead of discussion about how to have European Union in different speeds, we need to realize that there is future of Europe and European Union with different needs, in which people in different parts of the world, because of economic reasons, because of identity reasons, because of cultural reasons, they have different needs under one big umbrella, hoping 500 plus million people. When I say 500 plus, I mean it's Boris, Recep, and myself. We are in that plus. We are not in that 500 million yet. Which leads me to the conclusion, because we are coming from part of the world that is known as Balkan. So the ultimate question for European Union, are we going to witness Balkanization of European Union, or we are going to see Europeanization of Balkan? And that leads me to the second point, that the European Union has to adapt and move forward in a new time in which we are witnessing the changing economy. Because European Union became the most powerful when it comes to economy. Out of all those parameters, as Ismail was pointing out. In that sense, the very big question is, will Europe, an economy, be able to change, to be driven from the capital or cash-driven to be driven by creativity, innovation, and education? Will Europe lead that process, or will be just following others? And finally, the point of that is, we have to see that some models of future Europe, some parameters of future Europe model are stable. What should be stable? Vision, values, goals, changing nature of EU in sense of being better and being larger, which leads me to my favorite question, enlargement of Europe. I don't want to talk too much about it because it's about enlarging to Southeastern Europe. Maybe now when Brits walk out, there will be more space to get some good students to get in. And of course, we have to think about moving parameters that we have to take care about. And they are, as I strongly support, and I think that Ismail gave us excellent introduction, inequality. It has to be Europe which is not going further with inequality. It has to tackle the issue of inequality. It has to tackle the issue of identities, in sense unity and diversities, in sense of multiple identities. It has to be Europe that is inclusive, not exclusive. Europe of the intellectual bridges, not intellectual and physical walls. And finally, Europe that will be interconnected in every aspect using new technologies and things like that. So the last point is very simple. Yesterday, Ismail, or was it yesterday? You showed me, I want to thank you again for showing us this Imhotep 14.5 centimeters statue artifact in Bibliotheca Alexandrina, our grandfather of all intellectuals in the world. So Europe needs new Imhoteps. I don't know, does Europe and European need more priests? As it said below, you know, there's a little line in Bibliotheca Alexandrina, which you're all very familiar with, that Imhotep was priest, he was healer. Europe needs healers. Of course, it was said that he was magician. I hope we will not look for magicians, because magicians and populists should be left aside for a certain period of time before we really do find real healers and a medicine that is Europe of values. So thank you very much.
Your Excellency, President Tadic, after we've talked about the Balkanization of Europe and the Europeanization of the Balkans, and the need for magicians and and healers. You're a great healer, so and a great fighter too. So please feel free.
Thank you, dear Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is a really great honor to me to participate on this forum in such important Egyptian, but not only Egyptian, intellectual and political institution. Also, in past few days, that was great honor to me to participate on board of trustees of Bibliotheca Alexandrina and to meet our Egyptian friends and to talk about this beautiful and amazing country, which has nowadays even more important role in the global arena than before, taking into account how world is going to be more complicated, vulnerable, with really many, many problems. One of that problem is lying in the issue of identity, which is one of the most ignored issue in political arena in the past. And because of that, that issue is becoming very important nowadays, and it is going to be even more important in the future. One of the problems is lying in ignoring identities, underestimating different identities, and the issue and significance of identities. We see that in the context of some ideas of clash of civilizations. We see that in some ideas of intervention in the military arena in the past few decades. We see that everywhere, especially in the economic sector. Dearest Ismail Seregaldin has been mentioning the problem of inequality. I would like to underline that one of the foundations of European Union and European spirit is a French Revolution. Égalité, fraternité, et liberté. Égalité, we can translate to equality. And if we are taking into account figures nowadays, we'll see that we have an increase of inequality, which is not going to bring harmonious system within societies, but contrary, to make many divisions and many tensions. Those tensions are able even to destroy such societies. A few days ago, I was talking with two prominent Russian intellectuals. We talked about Russia, trying to define Russian identity. One of them have said, but what is a Russia? How to define Russian identity? What is the foundation of Russian identity? Such a big country with many diversities. We started to talk about St. Petersburg. I said this is one of the most beautiful cultural center, architectural site worldwide. One of them have said, well, this is more belonging to the Scandinavian culture and the Finns. The other have said, well, this is more Baltic. But this is very interesting. What is definition of identity nowadays? Is it language, belonging to the country, cultural issue, DNA issue. From my point of view, this is more cultural issue. Culture is a key. Culture is foundation. And culture is lying also in foundation of politics. Politics is everywhere, but culture is always in foundation of politics. Because of that, I'm very proud to participate in such important cultural institutions, which is Biblioteca Alexandrina. But at the same time, that institution can have one of the most important roles in cultural and political communication in order to explain differences of such very important part of the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are coming to the issue of Europe and European identity. What does mean European identity? Is it possible for Europe to keep position of the global power without defining European identity? I think this is not possible. Is European Union able to define European identity, not only European Union identity today? I think European Union is facing with the problems to do that today, especially after economic crisis and the case with the Lehman Brothers, which is showing to all of us how European Union is vulnerable nowadays, even though figures are impressive. GDP, production, volume, even gold medals on Olympic Games. Everything is impressive, but there is a problem into the foundation. From the beginning of my political life, I was in favor of European Union integration of my country. Everyone in my country recognized me as the first politician who was in favor of that among the current generation of politicians. But even I have some suspicions regarding capability of European Union to define their own identity and to take role which European Union is deserving, take into account historical impact, economical, and all other impacts. European Union is facing with many challenges today. We have a problem to define all challenges European Union is facing. We can try, but this is endless story, and this is problem. This is not only about role of the central bank, future of euro, relations between European Union members, European Union legal framework, European Union after Brexit, European Union after victory of Macron. This is also about refugees or migration crisis. This is also about whether Turkey is belonging to European Union or not, which kind of relations European Union is going to have with Russia, especially in the context of crisis with Ukraine, what kind of relations European Union is going to have with the United States, especially in the context of Brexit, and which kind of reaction European Union is going to form in the context of Islamic State and their activities. Look the map of problems, and let's try to analyze whether European Union is capable to solve such problems. We from the Western Balkans that are on the path towards European Union membership are really small problems in comparison with all other problems. I am following carefully what new generation of politicians among the European Union countries is doing right now. I'm carefully analyzing whether new leaders are capable to solve such problems and to find a response of the challenges European Union is facing with nowadays. I'm working every day very hard to be optimist in that context. I'm trying to convince myself to be very optimistic, even though we have many, many facts that are clearly showing to everyone that we cannot be such optimistic. But the problem is that European Union countries are not having good alternative. Even countries that are member states of European Union, not only countries that are trying to become member states of European Union. We don't have a good alternative to that. That means that we have to work very hard on stabilizing European Union, on working on definition of our identity, on creating harmony with the cultures, different cultures, to understand, especially, better relations between Islam and Christianism. And in that context, ladies and gentlemen, Egypt, as one of the pillars of Islamic State, can be inevitable and extremely important. This is why I'm asking you to participate in that process. And this is why this topic is not very strange to be organized in the such institution in this city. This is very important. Without that kind of definition, cultural definition, religious, and also political, and in terms of security and economy, we cannot find a stable and sustainable solution, which is even more important for the future. European Union has a future. European Union has to define themselves. European Union is going to change something in the structure of European Union. Is it going to be double or triple speed process? I'm not very much in favor of that, to be very frank with you, because this is going to bring more divisions in the future, despite of current divisions we have, not only among the European Union societies, which were underlined by Ismail Seragaldin in terms of Gini coefficient, richest and the poorest people, but also among the European countries, North and South. South is a poorer, North is a richer. Countries, entities, are not sustainable if they have such a big divisions and differences among themselves. And this is why I hope I'm trying to do everything that is possible in my talks, participation in international fora, to work on explaining very dangerous situation all of us are facing with. And this is why we have to do everything that is possible. This is also in the deep interest of Egypt to have a stable and sustainable European Union. We have to do everything to help each other right now. Because not only European Union, but whole world is on the crossroad. Whole world is on the crossroad. This is very unique situation, historical situation, having in mind the history of the mankind. We can go to the right direction. I don't know, is it on this side or this side? We can go on the very wrong and the bad direction, but this is up to the intellectuals, intellectual institutions, cultural institutions, politicians, people that are working in the economic sector. This is very important to bring whole elite together and to find solutions, to talk, to start to communicate, to understand each other better, and to find solutions. Otherwise, we are in a very dangerous situation. Thank you.
Thank you, President Boris Tadic, and thank you for this very lucid and encouraging statement that I know your history as a fighter, so I'm glad to see that we're fighting on the same side on this issue. Let me now turn to the last but not least of our panelists, President Recep Mejdani of Albania. Mr. President.
Thank you, Chairman, honorable colleagues. I'd like to say some words about the problem of today in European Union and also what could be the future of this organization. In fact, the greatest project of our time, particularly after the Second War, was the European Union. And actually, this project is suffering in different aspects. It's suffering in economic aspect, in political one, in security aspect, social aspect, or in problems regarding the enlargement or immigration, etc. But the first question, in my view, it's the political aspect. This aspect was shaped by the Brexit. And I believe this was a mistake in the European Union to accept a country without respecting all the rules of the European Union. So leaving some red lines from the time of Margaret Thatcher. So the Brexit was a real concern about the future of European Union. But now let's see, or let's hope that this Brexit is not more creating new troubles for European Union. The second trouble of today in European Union, what also Dr. Ismail has mentioned, is the rising of populism. And in my view, this concern is a great one. It's not only, well, Austria, with this kind of party, Freedom Party, or this populism of another party in Netherlands, again called Freedom Party, or National Front in France. But we have also populist and anti-establishment movement everywhere in European Union countries. Like in Italy, you know, 5 Stars movement in Italy. It's also in Greece. We have in Spain. We have also in Germany, which was the main pillar of the European Union. We have this alternative for Germany, and in some elections, they have reached this level of 7 to 20%, which means that, well, we have this not so positive perspective also in Germany. Fortunately, in all these new elections, including Netherlands, including Austria, or France, well, the progressive forces have won these elections. In Austria, what I can say is we have had the presidential elections, but in the general elections, well, there is a chance for this offer to win this election, to have the government. But, okay, for me, the main pillars are France and Germany. And if you see what was happening in France, for me, well, there is a perspective for safeguarding European Union at least for 5 to 10 years. It's sure that this European Union has this kind of perspective, positive perspective. What will happen after 10 years? It depends what we'll do about this kind of populist movement. And for that, I believe it's to find or to maybe, yes, to find some solutions for making this populism less important. And one of them is, well, regarding the elites, what we have to do on the political elites. The political elites in Europe now are going down. So what are people participating in the political life? Well, the level is not what it was before. So it's not a question of magicians, but how to select the right people for this leading of different countries. The second element linked to this elites, it's well, to find the right people, not corrupted one. If you see what is happening in Europe, well, if you consider, for example, the case of France, it was, well, Fillon was one of the candidates from the right party. Well, has been corrupted. We didn't know before. And aesthetically, also, the former president, because today Macron was awarded like a new president, also aesthetically, Hollande was not the right person to be president. So this was one aspect, how to find the right people for leading different countries in Europe. And the aspect of corruption is very important, to find this corruption. Another one is, how to ameliorate the system, the fiscal system, and to make this system equal in different countries of the Europe. If you see what is happening in France, well, the level of taxes regarding the revenues is nearly 60%. Well, it's too much. And if you make a comparison with Germany, well, people are thinking what to do, to stay in France or to go to another country, which means that there is a real problem in the fiscal system within the European Union. So it's how to have the right reform, institutional reform, also in the European Union, in the fiscal aspect. Another one, which also Dr. Ismail has mentioned, is unemployment. Unemployment is quite high, and remedy is difficult to be found, but it's a real problem there. And if we don't find solutions, well, these populist movements will be stronger and stronger. There are other problems regarding the price, and one of the concerns, which also have pushed the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, was this bureaucratic rules. The rules in the level of European Union are in general quite bureaucratic. So how to be more elastic and to avoid these problems, as it was, for example, in United Kingdom regarding the free movement. And people that have voted for Brexit, well, they've based on this idea of blocking this free movement. What is another question that we feel also in this in the Balkans? Well, it's the problem of democracy. The democracy is becoming less important in Europe. And when we have problems in our country, well, they don't pay too much attention to our democratic development, but they pay much more attention to stability. And, well, it's a kind of standard. They are working more to stability than to the process of democratization. And I believe your president, El-Sisi, was right when he has spoken today in front of us about the double standard. So what these people in Europe, in political level, what they are saying in public, and what they are doing behind the doors. So this kind of, let's say, double standard is not helping the European Union. It's not making this union healthy. As you see, inside the European Union, we have candidate countries, or we have also members of European Union which are suffering regarding the democratic process, including Hungary, or in the case of Balkans, Macedonia also is suffering as a candidate member. What we need more is also the reforms in social aspects, because welfare state, which was a kind of invention after the Second War, it's not more producing more the right results. So we have to think about this welfare system in the level of European Union, including different countries, because it's becoming quite difficult to cover this system, social system, inside the scheme of welfare system. And for me, it's necessary to redefine this question of the scheme of welfare system. And regarding what also my colleague Vaira has mentioned, we have a problem regarding the global order, globalization, and also, which is in the case of European Union, is European order, and the nation state. If you see carefully what is happening in Europe, well, we're speaking about the European order, but on the other side, well, it's clear that the focus in the most part of countries is concentrated on nation state order. In my view, well, this is a question that needs to be redefined because, well, studying this kind of paradigm linked to the balance between the continuity and discreteness in science. I have studied and also I've made a lot of publications on this paradigm, discreteness and continuity in the level of structure, in the level of interactions, in the level of spectrum of quantities, in the level of also state and time. We see that, well, there is a kind of balance between these two elements. And if we are transferring these ideas in the case of social and political order, we have to consider this fact that the globalization is continuity and the state, nation state, it's is discreteness. And we have to put them together to find a kind of link between them, the right balance between them, because otherwise, different politicians will play again with nationalism and with this protectionism, as it was, let's say, the play of President Trump during the elections. So, for me, regarding the Europe, we have many successes, but on the other side, we have a lot of problems to be resolved, to be rethought, and to have the right definitions for the next future. Otherwise, we can have, in one day, you can have not more European Union, but we have the split of this fantastic and the great organization. And to safeguard it, we have to work on that.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I think we've touched upon a number of very powerful themes here, one being that there is a notion of identity. Identity politics seem to have taken over from the traditional right and left view of economic benefits. There is a great recognition that this is a historical moment, as Boris Tadic has said, and where we may need a new revitalization of the dreams and the visions. I want to comment from all that you said about 3 or 4 things. One is that the EU is viewed as a common market and trade issues, but it is really the greatest political peace project ever. And it succeeded within one generation to have young Frenchmen and young Germans who cannot imagine that their countries would ever go to war again. And this in itself is an enormous achievement, and it's an even bigger achievement that the next generation said that the Franco-German alliance would become the motor for the expansion and unification of Europe. Now, we've lost that vision. We are struggling with the emergence of illiberal democracies. Stability versus democracy is everywhere. problem of the welfare system, problems of inequality within countries, as I showed, but also, as we were just reminded by our speakers, between countries, the north and the south of Europe itself. And the loss of a sense of purpose for Europe on the world order. What is Europe trying to achieve? I mean, it's not even putting its own house in order, much less does it have a vision for what it wants to do in the rest of the world, regardless of the size of the economy and the number of Olympic medals it won. And I want to leave you with this very interesting observation. Practically every one of the populist movements that are rising against the established order are talking about the absence of freedom, even though you have mentioned that this is 500 million people who are free to work wherever they want, to live wherever they want, to study wherever they want. But they still talk about the absence of freedom. That is the populist move. The second thing is that they are striking at national identity and protecting national identity, even when national identity is all mixed up. If you think about Brexit for a moment, the Scots wanted to stay, the Northern Irish people wanted to stay, the London region wanted to stay, England and Wales wanted to leave, and these cleavages are very clear, so how can we say that it is identity? And the third, of course, is the struggle for jobs. Yet a common market of 500 million of the richest people on the planet is probably the best place where you should be able to find a job. So why is it that the populists are hitting on those three themes time and again and finding a responsive view? And so I go back to something my good friend Zlatko said. Europe is too serious to be left to Europeans. And we are very lucky that we have two very distinguished Egyptians who are going to comment about their views about the future of Europe. And I will call first Mr. Amr Musa to share his reactions to the panelists, and then Dr. Mustafa Al-Fiqi will share his reaction. So if we can have a microphone for His Excellency Amr Musa, or would you prefer to speak? You can speak at the podium if you prefer.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Farouk Ismail. Thank you. Distinguished former presidents and prime ministers from the Balkan and Baltic European regions, Dr. Sirajuddin Ismail Sirajuddin, who is by himself a power to reckon with when it comes to soft power of culture, of art, of history. We wish him well on the occasion of his departure from the Alexandria Library. By the same token, we welcome the coming era of Dr. Mustafa Al-Fiqi as director of that distinguished institution. And I'm sure, knowing Mustafa, his dynamism, his love of culture, his contribution to the Egyptian society, he will be a big success in his new post. Distinguished former ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We have listened carefully to the interventions by 4 European figures, advancing several arguments about today Europe and tomorrow's Europe. I wish, first of all, to tackle the issue of identity and to answer the question, why is this panel? And why the audience, Egyptian audience, is here assembled to participate, to listen, and perhaps to ask. Because Europe, for us, is a special region. Europe is our neighbor. with a lot of historical interaction, negative and positive. Europe is our rich neighbor, where, when it comes to development, economic development, with all its elements of trade, of investment, of financial relations, it is a region, Europe is a region to reckon with. It is also an advanced, very advanced cultural base, where many of us, many generations in this country and in this region chose to go and benefit from the universities, the education system, and what Europe represents as a major soft power. But also, Europe is an international player, and one of the major players, if we want to count them, we say America, China, Russia, and Europe. Not ignoring Japan, not ignoring the rising powers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But being neighbors is not enough. But I would refer you to the inaugural speech of the President of the Republic, President el-Sisi, when he referred to the identity of Egypt. He said Egypt is an Arab country, an African country, and a Mediterranean country. This is a very important statement, a Mediterranean country. Here comes the link in identity between the Europeans or Europe, between Arabs or the North African and Eastern Mediterranean, because all of us assemble, sit together, talk together, cooperate together, or supposed to do so in the Mediterranean area. Yes, Europe is responsible for many of the problems, crises, and negative developments that occurred in this part of the world, starting with Sykes-Picot and tackling the issue of Israel, the Palestinians, Israel, the Arabs, and the big tension that engulfs this region. This leads to the issue of the future of this region, not only the future of Europe, but the future of the region in general, Europe, the Mediterranean, and all those countries around the Mediterranean. So when we talk about the future of Europe, we are in fact talking also about the future of the rest of this very strategic, vast area of countries, of peoples, and of economies, of history, and of future. There has been talk about the 500 million inhabitants of Europe. We have to talk also about the 400 million inhabitants of the south and east shores of the Mediterranean. So it is almost a billion inhabitants, a billion human beings between Europe and the other shores of the Mediterranean. This is a very important challenge, in the present and in the future. Europe, as was mentioned by you, former Prime Minister, and by President Tadic, 500 million people, as we were told, optimism is second to pessimism. So 2-1. Why are they, Europeans, are that pessimists? We were told that, just to quote you, 500 human beings living in prosperity, 1, in the biggest single market, 2, benefiting from the biggest single market, 2, and biggest peace project in the world, in the history of the world. People with such advantages, prosperity, security, peace proposals, cooperation, interaction, should be happy, should be optimistic. But then we look at the other side of the coin, rising populism, threats of disintegration, radicalism, terrorism, overflow of immigration, all that affected the European feelings and created a prevailing feeling of fear, concern, and pessimism. When President Boris Tadic, talked about the necessity to launch a dialogue between Christian Europe and Muslim Middle East and Arab world, I'm sure that he did not mean a religious dialogue. It is a political dialogue. It has to be a political dialogue with several dimensions, including religious, including economic, including so many other elements. But it is mainly a political dialogue that has to be we have to embark on in order to set the record straight. How are we going to live the rest of the 21st century, live together? And here, I would refer you and underline the fact that we in the Mediterranean have a convention, the Barcelona process, the so-called Union for the Mediterranean. We worked out those things. We started launching the Mediterranean cooperation in the beginning of the 90s, the last decade of last century. The club, the Mediterranean Club in 1993 and 4, then the Barcelona process in 1995, then the Union for the Mediterranean in 2008. It is working, but very low-key. And I believe that the time has come for all of us in Europe and the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, to sit together again and update that convention, which we all signed. Fields of cooperation, there are 3 baskets. We're already working: the political and security, the economic and social, and the cultural. The political and security were most active. The economic basket was active, but was affected by the neighborhood policy that all of you benefit from, and it was kind of competition between the southern shore of the Mediterranean and the Balkan countries, who were addressed mainly by the neighborhood policy of the European Union. That is a must. We have a project already there. We have a convention signed by over 50 countries. We have baskets, we have meetings, we have secretariat in place in Barcelona. So perhaps one of the first things that we have to raise, you have to raise perhaps in the European society of nations in the European Union, and with France in particular, that the time has come for France to come back to this point. And for your information, that was a joint project between the French and the Egyptians back in 1991, 2, and 3. And then we moved to Barcelona to sign the convention that brought all the Europeans and all the Mediterraneans together. Now, in addition to this Barcelona process or the Mediterranean project, we in the Middle East are duty-bound to draft a new regional order. The current regional order cannot work. We have to talk about what is the future of this region and what should be done. And I'm one of those who believe that when we come to talk about the regional order, in particular the security order, we cannot agree on things only within the countries or in the Middle East or in Europe, but in the Mediterranean too. So when we talk about security, we cannot say only security in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, etc., but also in Europe, because Europe is very much threatened by instability. I hope that it will not reach the point of disintegration. I don't think it will, but with the troubles that Europe is facing, I believe it is not a question only of refugees, but what was behind, what caused all that. We need to discuss, we need to talk, and to be very frank together, who did what, where the mistakes were, and I believe Europe should be accused of so many mistakes that will have to be very frankly, openly, directly discussed between us. Last point, Europe is also a player in the international arena. What happens to Europe, the role of Europe between China, Russia, America, etc., the pivot to Asia will affect Europe. And what affects Europe will affect the Mediterranean, will affect all of us. So I hope that this panel would open the door for a rich discussion about the relations, special relationship between the Arab world, or the Middle East in general, and Europe, within the framework of the library. And I call on my friend, good friend Mustafa Al-Fiqi, to take good care of that, that this panel should lead to more discussions, more specialized discussions about the security, about economy, about culture, about soft power, about history, what happened, and what should be done between us, since we all are gathered within this framework, until we move to recreate, update the issue of the Mediterranean cooperation, Barcelona, or the Mediterranean Union, whatever the name would be. Thank you very much, gentlemen, madam, and everybody.
Thank you, Your Excellency Amr for this very perceptive and very direct statement, both about recognizing past errors and looking to the future together. Now may I call on His Excellency Mustafa Al-Fiqi, the incoming director of the Library of Alexandria. Mustafa Al-Fiqi, thank you.
Dr. Farouk Ismail, Dr. Ismail Sirajuddin, who has both the base and traditions of these kind of meetings through the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, whom we will be following his steps with all admiration and respect, distinguished guests, we are honored to have you now in one of the old cultural spots in the whole region, not only in Egypt. But because of the limits of time and the long time Mr. Musa has taken already, then I have to just to give final remarks to the whole discussions, which I have followed carefully, and I'll put it in certain telegraphic points. Number one, Europe is not only for the Europeans, it's for the whole world. Europe is the source of civilization. Europe is the continent of Renaissance, of the geographical discoveries, of also even imperialism. If you look around you, as it was said, wherever you look, you will find everything either a British made or a French made or whatever it is. In the period of geographical discoveries, Spain and Portugal were leading. After that, Britain and France. And we are here at the largest nation south of the Mediterranean. We are related in one way or another. This couldn't be denied at all. We are as if an integral part of Europe, because the Mediterranean is the lake of civilization. What is in the north and in the south are linked with the history. And being specialized in modern political thought, I can assure you that Europe is the soft spot in the hearts of the humankind. Maybe the United States is more advanced technology-wise, either China, Japan, or whatever it is, but still, Europe is the source of the international consensus. You can't feel always, but Europe is the standard whom you have to look to in all changes and in different eras of history. The first remark is, I do believe much in what the President has said yesterday and repeated by His Excellency, the former President of Spain, about the double standard policy. We are suffering much in this part of the region from this kind of policy, and we feel sometimes that there are two standards, not only one, and the way they are evaluating certain events in a part of the world are not the same which they are using in another part. Number two, this double standard policy has taken apart from the confidence we had towards Europe and its traditions. We started to feel that Europeans now are different than what we have put in minds ages ago. Number three, if you look to globalization and to clash of civilization and to war against terror, which all have a special reference to the cultural element, you will feel, as an example, globalization. It's a flow of ideas, of funds, of whatever it is, except for human beings. For the first time, you can see that the move or transformation of people from a country to another is the most difficult one. We never had the same before in all history. Now you can see the queues in front of the embassies, the way they are being treated in the airports, and how most of them are rejected not to have visas to go to other countries. Though we have accepted and welcomed them coming from the north to the south for centuries, now it's difficult to do it in the other side, going from the south to the north. Of course, I have to give a special respect to the French style, where you can see a kind of, though it's not rosy, I quite agree, but still the coexistence between Muslims and Christians in a European country like this, it's a thing which needs to be appreciated and to say that we admire very much. The third point is that if we don't have Cold War in political wise, but we have it in the sense of economical affairs. Now Europe and the States and China, you will feel that there is a silent economic war globally, and this is something you can't deny, because we call it the economic Cold War. If we take the British style as an example, where I have been educated and lived for years and years, I can tell you that the dominant cultural factor of the English language gave the British an upper hand vis-a-vis the Latins and the German group, the Sylvism, or whatever it is. We feel that the British style, because of the extension across the Atlantic and the other side of the world, the United States of America, you will feel that it's strongly supported cultural-wise. Add to that, that the main language of the internet and the advanced technology of communication is using the English language. That's why it's a language of science and technology. This is also an advantage for the Europeans, though it's only limited to the Anglo-Saxons. I want to say that there is a difference between the advanced technology and the roots of civilization. The roots of civilization are still there in the continent, in Britain, France, Germany, wherever you want to say. Yes, you will see that, as I have said in the beginning, most of the problems, and it has been said by His Excellency Amr Musa also, by some European elements. If you look here, the Palestinian question, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's a good example of the double standard policy. If you see the way they are treating Israel and the way they are evaluating the reaction from the Palestinian side, it will give you a full proof of the way they are thinking. Even between India and Pakistan, where I lived some years in India, the Kashmir issue is also a British made. Wherever you go, you will see that religious and the political and the cultural reform is originally European. And also most of the problems in different parts of the world, in particular in Europe and Africa, are also from the European side. If we take the Turkish example, it's a very interesting one, because Turkey is geographically a very important strategic turn between Asia and the extension of Africa and the Mediterranean and Europe. And also it's a NATO state. You will see always that this state is showing that the Europeans are ready to swallow a lot of mistakes for a man like Recep Erdogan, which this will be rejected strongly for others, because maybe he is a member of NATO, because they need him for logistic affairs in the Middle East. But at the end of the day, this also is an additional proof of the double standard policy. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't like to say more because the limits of time, and I am one of those who prefer always to explain their ideas as much as he can in points. I feel that Europe for us is more important than any other part of the world. In the Middle East, North Africa, West Asia, this is our region, which is directly affected by the European policies and the European stands towards the problems of the area. We are looking for a day where the Europeans will be back to their own traditions of the Renaissance and for the roots of civilization, which we are used to understand from the soft point in our hearts, which is concentrated in Europe. Europe is very important for us, in particular in the south side of the Mediterranean, as we have been in history and geography, and all other elements are in a very close links. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafa. And yes, I think we all agree that we not only have a very soft spot for Europe, we are closely linked with Europe, not just politically, economically, but also culturally, and with a great deal of affinity. And thus, Zlatko, you did ask for not leaving Europe to Europeans. Well, you got your share back. I know that the hour is much advanced. I will just simply ask each of our panelists if they have any particular point that they are very eager to bring out, because if not, we have some tea and coffee and other things there, and we can talk around those with some of the guests before people depart, if you're so inclined. Is there anything that, Boris, you want to add anything? No? Ira? No? Bishop? No? That's good. No. Okay. Then Dr. Saad Nassar, you wanted to say something? The Vice President and Treasurer of our Academy. Tfaddal.
Your Excellencies, on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Farouk Ismail, the President of Institute d'Egypte, and on behalf of all members of the Board of Directors of the Institute and all distinguished members of the Institute, we would like to express our thanks and gratitude to Your Excellencies for being with us tonight. Thank you very much for this very informative, rich, comprehensive, and informative deliberations and discussions. We enjoyed being with you tonight and listening to you. Thanks to Bibliotheca Alexandrina for holding this seminar jointly with the Institute. Thanks to His Excellency Dr. Ismail Srageddin, the Director and the Founder of Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Thanks and congratulations to Dr. Mustafa Al-Fiqhi, the Director of Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Thanks to all distinguished members of the Board of Trustees of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Thanks to His Excellency Minister Amr, whom we consider the Dean of Egyptian and Arab diplomacy. Your Excellencies, we are looking forward strengthening, enhancing, and further deepening our programs of cooperation with you in all spheres and areas, not only political, but also economic, social, cultural. Thank you again, and we are looking forward seeing you and working with you in the future. Thank you, Your Excellencies, all of you. Good luck, good health, much success, and God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, please join us towards the back of the room. We have the chance to have further informal discussions.